I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I'm just an internet Christian Marxist influencer.
He's just a wooden boy, a regular wooden boy.
Transforming slowly into a real person through this podcast.
It's Thanksgiving.
Yeah, it's Thanksgiving. This is the last time the Magnificast will be recorded in Greenville, Illinois. I'm moving.
That's
I'm
right.
moving to that big city.
That's right. Two big city boys on this one podcast. We'll see if the airwaves can handle it.
Hey, I'm walking here.
Soon you will be. Now you're just sitting there.
That's true. Yeah, well, that's cool. What a big life transition's coming up here. It's also Thanksgiving. A lot to give thanks for, like the big city.
That's right. This episode will come out on Black Friday even. Not something to be thankful for, but a horrible, terrible liturgy of capitalism that nevertheless we all pass through each year.
Man, I just hope the best for all the workers, for all those Target employees out there. Good luck, y'all.
Yeah, I had to work retail once, but thankfully not in like a big box store or anything like that. And I cannot imagine being told that you have to be on the floor at 2 a.m. so that, the guy who used to coach your Little League team can get his TV at 3 a.m.
Yeah. Hey, one time I worked at Radio Shack and I was in community college. Radio Shack is also not a big box store, but it is a store. And I had to be at Black Friday at 5 a.m. And it was sort of all hands on deck. Everyone that worked at Radio Shack we were all there ready to sell some bad TVs and some terrible toys to people. And 6 a.m. rolled around and the doors opened up and not a single person showed up until 8 a.m.
Oh no. I don't like that at all.
Yeah, I know. I didn't get any good commissions that day. It was just a big wreck.
Did you make commissions at Radio Shack?
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, they have this whole situation where you make commissions, and if you sell mobile phones, cell phones, you get a lot of money. Well, not community college Matt a lot of money, not adult Matt a lot of money.
Real Jim Halpert over there.
That's right. It's a supremely dumb place to work, and it's, I think, almost out of business now. So there's that. That's what I'm thankful for.
That's right. The blackest of Fridays for Radio Shack in particular.
That's right.
All right. Well, we are not going to talk about that. So you're welcome. If you want good Thanksgiving related content, a while back, I don't know, last year, the year before, we read Combat Liberalism or something to talk about how you should talk to your family. So you can go back and find that. If you want. This week, though, we're actually talking about some religious left news. We've been doing these roundups periodically, just every once in a while, when there's enough accumulated material to make them make sense, to do something about them. And we've got some. We're going to get to it. We're going to talk about Mayor Pete. We're going to talk about Julian Castro. We're going to talk about Lenin and electoralism and everything else. But before we get there, Matt, I do have a holiday-themed Reddit for you.
Okay.
I want to run by you.
Uh-huh.
All right.
Lay it on me.
The title here is simply, I've done goofed up. And it is from 2 years ago, so I'm not sure how relevant this will be, but just to, I'm sure this is a very universal experience that will be communicated here. So this user says, I was Black Friday shopping today, and I freaking got unjustifiably angry at someone. I repented and asked for forgiveness, but I wish I could actually apologize to the person I hurt. I didn't see the person face to face. I slandered their name behind their back, and I feel awful.
No, not
Anyone
good.
got any control your anger type of advice? Because it's a struggle for me.
Uh-huh. Now, you've come to the right place on this one.
Yeah, I thought I might have.
I am the dad to an extremely just... I'm just a 4-year-old, a regular 4-year-old, but he can go from 0 to 100 angry in no seconds flat. So I do know all of the great strategies to help you out with controlling your anger this holiday season. Okay, so step 1, you could do, this is the Daniel Tiger technique. You just take a deep breath and then you try it again.
That's a good one.
You do, yeah, it's a good one. It's great. The other one is, let's see, the other person. Okay, so you're very angry, and then have the other person yell at you and make you feel bad and take away your Legos. That's a thing you could try. Yeah, that requires the other person to kind of take some real control of the situation, and your Legos. But it's something you could try. Let's see, you could have another person distract you with Star Wars. That's something. Maybe that would be good for your anger issues.
Good. Yeah, that seems good.
So just like here's what you do. So you're going to go to the mall. It's Black Friday. You need to get that big TV. But you know that you're not going to be able to do that without being very angry at somebody because, Black Friday is an inherently terrible situation and you're already an angry person or whatever. So you have to hire someone to do this because you wouldn't want to just rely on a friend or family member to kind of be there for your wrath. But you hire somebody to come along and they are going to show you clips of the Phantom Menace every time you get too mad about something. And then you'll just be distracted. You'll be like, wow, I love pod racing. Here's
the challenge, though. This person in particular got freaking unjustifiably angry at someone and didn't even see this person face to face. They slandered them behind their back. And I'm just thinking, the scheme that you're working out here, it sounds fine, it sounds good, but what if you're so unjustifiably freaking angry that you can't even communicate it to the person that you brought along to hold you accountable, your anger accountability partner?
Yeah, no, that's hard. Yeah, I mean, I think if you get too mad and no one can even talk to you, you just gotta, that other person, they just need to be with you there for a minute, sit through your tantrum, and then they do need to take your Legos away. That's going to be part of it. I'm so sorry that has to be the way that it is, but it's just, that's what it is. You got to take your Legos away.
Fair enough. There are 2 good suggestions here in the comments. A number of them are actually good, saying maybe you should think about anger management. That's great.
No, absolutely. That's what you should really do. Probably seek counseling, anger management, all of those things is really the answer.
Yeah, and someone also does say, just don't worry about it. One person suggests Warren Wiersbe gives a very easy way to start your day. That's a guy who wrote a devotional, so you could just read a devotional every day and you'll never get angry.
Well, that'd make you more angry.
Response.
Okay.
Another is that you could go to the subreddit for Stoicism because they are our brothers in ethics, perhaps even our twins. So you could ask the Stoics what to do.
The Stoics are the twins of Christian ethics?
Perhaps, this person says. Perhaps.
Perhaps is doing a lot of work there.
Well, I think we've got the take your Legos away solution is a pretty good one. Worth trying today on Black Friday. This Black Friday, if you see someone getting angry, just intervene. Get those Legos. You'll be the hero. You'll have saved everybody. You'll save the day.
Get those Legos or show them the clip from Phantom Menace where they do pod race, and that's enough to distract most people from their anger because it's so good.
I do think if I was unjustifiably freaking angry and someone out of nowhere came to the rescue with a pod racing scene, I'm not sure how I would reply, but it would distract me from my anger. I'll say that.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. That's enough of that. We're done. We've done our holiday duties. We've paid the bill, the holiday bill. And now we're talking about the religious left, the one thing that nobody ever asked us to talk about, but the one thing that we're constantly going to anyway. Our brand at this podcast is all about being, authentically, faithfully Christian, while also being authentically, faithfully Marxist. That would be our
That's
radio
our
DJ
brand.
intro.
Yeah.
Communism, revolution, Jesus, church lock-ins, we love it all. We've been through it all. We're still in some of it. These are all qualities, though, that you'd never find in an actual politician until Mayor Pete Buttigieg showed up on the scene. The ultimate Christian leftist. Not exactly, but there are journalists who would like you to believe that. Mayor Pete is still somehow a contender to be the Democratic candidate to go up against Donald Trump in the next year's election. And this past week, Buttigieg is still riding that train of being the progressive Christian out there. Pretty much everybody on stage except like Bernie, I think, is a Christian. But at the end of the day, it's Mayor Pete who's turned it into a brand, a personal brand. It's something that will probably get him some great book deals once all this is over. But in light of all that, we thought we'd do an episode that gives us a little bit of an update on the state of the religious left discourse in the U.S. And you might be thinking, haven't you already done that episode? You'd be right. We have done it twice, I think. But the discourse keeps evolving, and we're going to keep up with it, and we're going to keep you up to date with it.
So in this episode, we're going to talk a bit about how Pete Buttigieg interprets his politics in light of his faith. We're going to kind of pull some stuff he did with Jim Wallace, an interview he did. It's I would say it's interesting, but it's not. And then we'll do a little bit of media criticism with regard to Mayor Pete and another candidate who just scored a little more religious left street cred, Julian Castro. This is not an endorsement of either of these people, very clearly so. Julian Castro is not even like on the debate stage, which is, I think, unfortunate, actually. But anyways, he had this thing a few weeks back where he was with some Catholic workers, and it's kind of interesting. So anyways, we'll take those two politicians into consideration with regard to the religious left, and then we'll like round out the conversation in a little bit more of a broad, and Marxist way, with some thoughts on why leftists in general should care about electoralism and politics and this whole big election anyways.
Yeah, so let's start with Mayor Pete. This past week, a few articles came out that indicated that Mayor Pete is doing well in the Iowa polls. A supreme tragedy. We all sort of thought Mayor Pete was on the downhill, but apparently not. Iowa is always one of those contested states that somehow has a lot of power in elections. I don't know. If you don't know anything about it, you're doing great. You're lucky and you shouldn't worry about it, but it's important because it's an early state that votes in primaries, and so it kind of like sets the tone along with a number of other states for the rest of the primary season. So it's kind of a big deal. So this small spark of hope for Mayor Pete fed into the larger Mayor Pete media discourse, and then in turn the religious left. So Pete Buttigieg, he's one of the candidates who's most well known for being associated with what some journalists call the religious left, which is a pretty complicated way of just saying a Democrat who goes to church. We've talked about Mayor Pete in the past, and we've talked about that kind of media idea of the religious left in the past too. But just to give you some, maybe like a summation of how this has gone. So all before the primaries were happening, there were a number of journalists who were trying to insist that the religious left is a thing. People know the religious right is a thing, but trust us, these journalists said the left is too. And by the left, again, they meant Democrats, Christian Democrats, or Democrats who are willing to talk to Christians by and large. And at first, the person they proposed was Cory Booker, because he was, first of all, an early candidate to announce, and also he's a person who goes to church and does actually use that language of faith in his life and campaign, etc. So he was going to be the religious left candidate. But over time, Mayor Pete came out swinging, and he made that his brand. So Cory Booker sort of allowed journalists to run with it, but Mayor Pete really like invited it and leaned into it. I don't know if he saw like some kind of media niche that he could capitalize on or what, but he's become really the poster person for the religious left now. And that is revealed, especially in this interview that he did with Jim Wallace, who is, not, maybe he wouldn't call himself the voice of the religious left, but he certainly is the voice of the evangelical left in many respects, for better or for worse. That's Jim Wallace's role. So this interview that Jim Wallace and Mayor Pete do together is kind of, I don't know, symbolic or significant, because it's this meeting together of two people who have really taken on board an identification with progressive politics and their own Christian tradition.
Yeah, that all sounds about right to me. Man, too bad about Cory Booker. I like him better than Pete Buttigieg, but only marginally. Sorry, I have a lot of bad things to say about Pete Buttigieg, and I won't right now. Okay, so yeah, Pete Buttigieg, he's got this interview with Jim Wallace. It's been brought to my attention that Jim Wallace offered interviews to other people who are running as well, but Pete Buttigieg is definitely the person that took them up on it at this moment. So this isn't like necessarily a story about how Sojourners is giving preferential treatment to one candidate over others. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But this is definitely a place where Pete Buttigieg does articulate kind of his faith and his politics and how those things fit together in the most boring way imaginable. So the whole thing starts off with Jim Wallace, and he asks, "You've talked more about Jesus than any other candidate, Republican or Democrat. Why?" And Pete Buttigieg says some things. He says, "Because I think it's important, and because I fear that there's been an effort to recruit Jesus into one political party, the Republican Party. And of course, God doesn't belong to a political party in this country. And as Lincoln said, everybody's trying to get God on their side, but you're probably better off trying to make sure you're on God's side. But I think we need to just even the conversation out." I guess this is so funny to me because, like, I can't think of anything more. Oh, okay, I mean, obviously, Republicans using Jesus and Christianity to fuel their rhetoric and their policy and stuff is like absolutely nothing new. I mean, white supremacists have been doing that forever. But like when Pete Buttigieg says it, it just seems completely vacuous. Like it actually means nothing. I don't know what this means for his policy. And in fact, he doesn't say. There's a Vice article that came out a few days ago where Pete Buttigieg is asked about his policy. And Pete Buttigieg is like, "I don't know, man. We should just be really philosophical about this policy because like we don't know the answers." And I don't know. It's just a lot of bullshit. Anyways, when Pete Buttigieg talks like this, it just makes me feel like he has no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's weird because, I mean, so much of this interview is full of religious platitudes that sort of sound nice but aren't really saying anything, or things that you've heard 100 times from somebody else. So they don't actually contribute anything like unique or even tell you that much about Mayor Pete's own political paradigm, it seems to me. I mean, he clearly is trying to root his politics in a broader, like, moral imagination and framework, and people really praise him for that in some respect because it's trying to get the discourse to function in a different way or a different level. But the irony is, for all the moral framework that gets expanded, it basically ends up looking like the same old, neoliberal capitalism that everybody else has, at which point you're kind of like, well, please actually don't. Like, you might be damaging the possibility of a religious left more than affirming or funding it. I mean, certainly that would be, from our position, I think, pretty clear.
Yeah, totally. It's also just like so unimaginative and boring. I mean, Christianity is about like a Palestinian Jew who was raised from the dead, and also hated the Roman government, like executed by the state. He fed people just indiscriminately and healed them and like did all these like wild things. And Pete Buttigieg is like, "Well, I do think that people should be able to choose whether or not they want Medicare." It's like the most like like completely hollow and tepid sort of thing. Like if you really are a Christian, you believe all these like crazy things happened, man, are you doing the most boring thing you can imagine with it?
Yeah, well, let me read this other quote, and I think it actually gives us kind of a lot to bounce around here. So Mayor Pete, filling a little bit more of this out, he says, "I do think that if there is such a thing as a religious right, then there had better be something like a religious left, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be a mirror image. I think it means that above all that, people of faith know that they do have a choice. That if your religious values guide you in what you do in the voting booth, then make sure that's all of your religious values, including the ones about protecting the marginalized, being concerned for the poor, and respecting the dignity of everybody, and feeding the hungry, and identifying with prisoners and welcoming strangers. All the things that are in there. But it does, of course, diminish religion to reduce it to a political value system. There's a great peril, even as I often recruit religious arguments to try to explain what I think is morally at stake in what I have to offer." And he, criticizes the idea of fitting God into sort of a political box. There's kind of a lot going on in this packed-in paragraph. I mean, he's speaking off the cuff, but some rehearsed lines, I think. But the idea here that I want to start off with is just the thing he says right at the top about if there's a religious right, then there should be a religious left, although that doesn't necessarily mean it should be a mirror or a inverse of the religious right, it seems. And I think that's really like interesting because, I mean, yes, like that's true. That's very true, except so much of what the religious left looks like for Pete Buttigieg does actually seem like a mirror of the religious right to me. It's hard for me to sort of see how they're distinguished. I don't know, Matt, how did that strike you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that he's right. Like the Christian left or the religious left shouldn't look like the religious right, and that is, I think, true. But for Pete Buttigieg, it is exactly that. Like, well, we're the liberals, though. Like that's it, right? We're the progressive Christians who are going to, like, I don't know, keep DACA alive or something, and abortion is like a woman's right, and you know, like it's just going to be countering every single other religious right talking point with a religious left talking point. I mean, that's right. At least what I've seen of Pete Buttigieg when he talks about these things. It's like always just it is the mirror image. It's never thinking outside the box. It just seems, I mean, like even later in this like same quote, it seems so weird, right? Like it's about welcoming strangers and like identifying with the prisoners and being concerned for the poor. It's like, Pete Buttigieg, what are you talking about? Like when has a Democrat ever done these things? It seems so hollow because like the way that he would enact any of those things is completely, I don't know, stupid. It doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't actually show concern for the poor. It shows like concern for entrepreneurs and job creators and stuff like that. But it's just it's a way to talk about Christianity that seems progressive, but it's actually not. I think just offering the fact that like this is not the religious right is like enough for some people, but there's like nothing behind the curtain.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, this quote is also so strange because surrounding it in this interview is also all these weird appeals to national myth making in the United States. Like he really drives that home, that he thinks that there's a role for the nation and for nationality, and it's to sort of swell everybody into this spiritual identity that obliterates, you know, these antagonisms that are in the body politic. Like that's how he sort of speaks. And at one point he talks about how, you know, he had this military service and he really appreciated it. And he thinks there should be a mandated national service that he goes out of his way to say you should be able to volunteer for it, but there should be mandated service anyway, or at least sort of widely available national service that he thinks everybody should do. And it's really fascinating because what so often characterizes the religious right, and the thing that people get upset about, is that people see religion being made subservient to these other kinds of things, to national myth-making, to the idea that everybody should be in service to the nation state or something like that, or to the state itself or the nation itself, however you want to cash that out. But here is Mayor Pete doing exactly that, using these religious arguments to build a different kind of national myth. So it literally is, it seems to me, the exact mirror image of the religious right.
And sometimes even worse, right? Like not even Donald Trump has been like, well, everyone needs to serve in the military.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, I've been listening to a lot of the Know Your Enemy podcast, Sam Adler-Bell and Matt Sitman, and it's a great podcast if you don't listen to it. It's a couple of lefty guys talking to and about conservatism, trying to understand it and the different varieties of it, and really helpful and informative. But one thing Matt Sitman sometimes talks about is, it's a line from, I think, Pat Buchanan, about the conservatism of the heart. That there's this kind of conservatism that isn't necessarily even a mental exercise, but it's kind of an intuitive thing. You know, it becomes part of your way of being or something. And it seems to me that actually Buttigieg strikes me as sort of a conservative of the heart in many respects. I don't know if that's fair or true, but I guess that's just kind of the vibe that I sometimes get when he starts talking about religion or talking about what he wants to do with religion in these kinds of national revivals or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Have to ask the Know Your Enemy guys about that.
I guess so. Well, let me throw another one at you and hear what you think about this.
Okay.
So Pete Buttigieg goes on to say, in conversation with Jim Wallace, he says, there's also a question of power. Who is empowered by our political system? I would like to believe that one of the virtues of the democratic system is that it's more likely to enable those who've been marginalized to acquire power and to be made better off. But needless to say that some of the twisting of our democracy that's happened as a consequence of many things, some of which can be reversed by good policies, what they are we still don't know, like the role of money in politics that is made for a government, Even in the supposedly democratic nation whose very structure, it tends to comfort the comfortable and afflict the afflicted. All right, so he's kind of losing the plot at the end there.
Yeah,
again,
for sure.
This is a transcript, speaking off the cuff. But that idea that he's trying to communicate here of this is a question of power, and he'd like to believe that a democratic system could allow the marginalized to get power. What do you think about Mayor Pete saying that?
It's like, do you ever think that politics is just people lying in public and like we just get like we just are okay with it for some reason? Because that's how it feels. I don't know. Again, like what is he talking about? In what sense is this true? The marginalized are never able to acquire power. Like that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing about politics. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know what he's talking about. It's so weird. Like, I get it. He wants to believe in democracy, but it's hard because there are all of these threats to democracy in the United States. But, like, I don't think... I mean, this is assuming that the democratic process in the United States even works the way that it's supposed to. And I don't think that's even true.
Well, I mean, you can do that other kind of weird reversal where like it does work in the way that it's supposed to insofar as it doesn't allow marginalized people to have power or reverse the kinds of things that American democracy was built to preserve, like white supremacist rule or capitalist accumulation of wealth and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I buy that. I think that makes sense. But I guess in just going off the rhetoric of this thing right here that just said, it's like he's assuming that the system works in the first place, and that, even though there might be questions, but I just don't think that's true. I think that's I don't know. I mean, like the Donald Trump election, Donald Trump won over a person who had the popular vote, which Hillary Clinton would have sucked too, but like in a whole different way that at least kids might not be in cages. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's just it's just this weird naive assumption that democracy is even what we're doing here, and I think that's wrong-headed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting, too, because, we've talked to Jim Hodgson about Bolivia recently and then Venezuela earlier this year. And in both cases, what really struck me coming away from those conversations was Jim's insistence that you have to look at these projects, as flawed as they might be or contradictory as they might be or whatever, as ultimately projects of the poor trying to get power. And then what happens when they do. And people don't just kind of let it occur. And they do that through democratic means, right? Through these really intriguing political processes that are invented, like the commune structure in Venezuela, that give the poor a say and allow them to come together and have their own say, in a community. These kinds of democratic systems ultimately don't get respected by a place like the United States, which is, it's like... If Mayor Pete wanted to know how democratic systems embolden marginalized people to acquire power and then defend it, certainly he, there are other places he could look. But as far as I know, Mayor Pete doesn't have any investment in, denouncing the coup in Bolivia or something.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Jacques Rancière, sort of like left-wing, kind of postmodern philosopher sort of guy, has this book that I kind of like. It's been a bit since I've read it, so maybe I shouldn't say anything too explicit, but it's called Hatred of Democracy. But basically in the book, he says something really similar to what you just said, that democracy is not like a stable state. Like you don't have it or not. It's sort of like, do you have a lot of it or do you have a little of it? And what does that look like? So for Rancière, it's always like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that like, even though the United States political system is, democratic in some ways, it's not in others. I just don't want to sound like a complete defeatist about it and say there's no sort of way forward, because there probably is, but it's just like a very difficult one where you'd have to use the democratic system at hand to probably expand those claims in more robust ways. But that's a hard thing to do and very complicated, and Mayor Pete doesn't even know what that means.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in just a minute, exactly that problem. Before we do, though, let's leave Mayor Pete behind, but at least give a little bit of airtime to Julian Castro. So okay, everybody thinks Mayor Pete is the big religious left guy, like we said earlier. But it's kind of a questionable thing for reasons that we've said here, but also because every time Mayor Pete sort of vaguely alludes to the fact that he's been to church or talked about church, journalists seize on that. It's a moment that they take advantage of. It's a careerist thing, like to point this out and make that your niche, and it's fine. Like everybody does it. Journalists do it all the time. But like other candidates who actually do seem to meet the kind of religious left in an interesting way often don't get covered or don't even make a blip. Not to mention all the people who are part of the so-called religious left who are either not Christian or who are working in political fields outside of electoral politics. In any case, I think that the best example of this is something that just happened a couple weeks ago when Julian Castro met with some Catholic workers in Iowa. You'd think this would be front page news for like religious left journalists. And yet it made the news all over local news. Like we could find lots of things from local news, and someone from the Iowa Catholic Worker, thankfully, a guy named David Goodner sent us a bunch of these kinds of like local articles, which is very kind of you, David. Thank you. But none of these articles about this story trickled up to like any kind of mainstream reporting. As far as I know, no religious left folks even got that invested in it as a story at all. And yeah, I think it's worth kind of pointing out, not to endorse Julian Castro or anything like that, but just to sort of express, where the balance of coverage is weighted in terms of electoral reporting on the religious left. So Matt, could you maybe like walk us through a little bit the events here that happened a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, it's really straightforward. I mean, it's not like a huge showy event or anything, but it's like, I don't know, notable for sure. So, okay, Julian Castro, he is in Iowa. There's the Iowa City Catholic Worker House, just doing their thing. Catholic workers, we've talked about them on this podcast a lot. They're good. I'm not going to endorse Julian Castro, but I'm going to endorse the Catholic worker. Yeah, they're good. They show up for people. I mean, if nothing else, right? I think they have interesting politics. They have a really interesting sort of spiritual practice and religious heritage. That's all really cool. But they do definitely show up for people. They've been showing up for people who've been detained or deported, in the United States. So in light of all that, Julian Castro shows up to like the court case of this one particular like immigrant who's there in the United States. He's been here for 3 months, kind of fleeing Honduras and the violence there. But in light of that, ICE picked him up and put like an ankle bracelet on his body to track him, which is yucky in a lot of ways, to say the least. Anyways, the Catholic Worker House is kind of like rally around this person, and he's going to get the ankle bracelet taken off. So Julian Castro is like at the court date with the Catholic workers, and they're like there after this guy is like, kind of freed from this ankle bracelet, and they kind of are there to receive him as he comes out. And that's all really kind of interesting and touching and actually pretty sweet. Yeah. So after the fact, they like prayed outside the ICE facility, which is great. And then they all went back, Julian Castro included, to the Iowa City Catholic Worker House, and they had sort of like a forum on immigration and like what they're doing. And to me, this speaks way louder than Pete Buttigieg talking to Jim Wallace about like whatever Abraham Lincoln said about being on God's side or whatever. Like it's one thing to say you're a Christian and like, allude to the fact that you go to church, and isn't that cool? But like, I don't know, Julian Castro showed up with a bunch of Catholic workers to like an ICE facility. That's something. Way more interesting than everything that Pete Buttigieg has ever said. So again, I'm not here endorsing Julian Castro, but it's good. It's good to say the least. It's something like that is noteworthy, that is more religious left than other things, qualitatively so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, not endorsing Julian Castro, whatever, but it is a big deal that he, first of all, would connect with the Catholic worker in this way, and secondly, would even spend time, thinking in their space, like with people who are telling him stories. Like there were a lot of in the coverage of it, there's a lot of comments from immigrants who met him and said that they felt listened to and all that kind of thing. And like, that is important. And I think it's interesting too because like Julian Castro is not going to win the nomination. Like he knows that this event will not have skyrocketed him to the top of the polls. It will not have changed anything. He didn't even make the debate stage last time around, and he's not going to make the next one either. But I think it's actually pretty laudable that he's making use of this kind of weird social capital that he has for just a minute. Like he's a presidential candidate and he has been on the debate stage, and so he can draw at least some attention to these kinds of things. That's not nothing. And it's like making use of something kind of interesting to build at least not just even an awareness, but like a sort of affirmation of accompanying people against their ICE check-in or something. I think that's meaningful.
Yeah, so Julian Castro sure did something. That's interesting. I am interested. Yeah, too bad that he won't make the next debate because it'd be cool to hear him talk about that.
I mean, it would be better to hear him than that billionaire guy whose name I can't remember right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember his name either. I'd rather hear Julian Castro than most of those folks, but whatever. Cool. Well, you might be thinking, listen, I thought this was a Marxist podcast. I thought I was going to hear about communism and socialism and revolution, and you're not wrong. You're going to hear about that. But electoralism is a question that communists and socialists and, well, definitely anarchists, they're mad about it though, have been talking about just forever. Can communists and socialists and left types participate in bourgeois parliaments, in bourgeois elections? It's a good question. So we thought we could answer that question now since we've spent so much time talking about them. Like, you might be thinking why, but here's why. So we're just going to get right to the bottom of this one really quick. This question that people have been talking about for 200 years or whatever. Okay. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of tackle this question, but it's pretty clear like what's at stake, right? Like if you think that you should overturn the system altogether, you think that capitalism is bad and the state that wields it is also bad, then like why would you even want to participate in electoral politics? Why even give it sort of like the time of day, or why would you even, dignify it with your own participation or whatever? Does that seem like a good characterization of the argument, Dean?
Yeah, I think so.
Or the sentiment, maybe. Okay. Cool. Well, guess what? Lenin, he talks a lot about this. Vladimir Lenin, our main dude next to Marx. Yeah, he has a lot to say about electoralism and parliaments. And the thing I always like about Lenin, I'm not a longtime Lenin fan over here, but the thing I do appreciate about Lenin, the more I read about him, is that he's like extremely practical, and he's never like going to take like a hard ideological line for no reason. So that's cool. So this is we have a few different quotes here from Lenin that we can kind of use to think about electoralism and why these questions are even important, about why we should care about these weird Democrats. So anyways, from a bigger essay that maybe we should talk about someday called Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder.
Great title.
It's a crazy title. Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, well, Lenin, he talks about this. He sort of has like a chapter set aside for this. The title of the section is called Should We Participate in Bourgeois Parliaments? And in it, Lenin says this: parliamentarianism has become historically obsolete. That's true in the propaganda sense. I like that. I like that qualification. There's a propaganda sense, and then there's like a real sense. However, everybody knows that this is still a far cry from overcoming it in practice. Capitalism could have been declared, and with full justice, to be historically obsolete many decades ago, but that does not at all remove the need for a very long and very persistent struggle on the basis of capitalism. Okay, so what he's saying here is that parliamentarianism, bourgeois elections, like, listen, they're bullshit. They're not good. It's all kind of a farce. But at the same time, you can't just say they're over and done with and ignore them, because they're still happening whether you like them or not. He goes on further to talk a lot about German leftists in this bit of an infantile disorder. He's real critical of those German leftists, probably rightfully so. He goes on and says this about those German leftists. An attempt to circumvent this difficulty by skipping the arduous job of utilizing reactionary parliaments for revolutionary purposes is absolutely childish. You want to create a new society, yet you fear the difficulties involved in forming a good parliamentary group made up of convinced, devoted, and heroic communists in a reactionary parliament? Is that not childish? It is. It is childish. Basically, he's just like, I don't know, you're like, you want to make a whole new society, but you don't want to get involved in electoralism. But like, why? You're gonna have to kind of like use every tool that is available to you. So might as well jump in and get your hands dirty. You don't want to you don't want to just like ignore electoralism as a possible like site of struggle, whatever that might look like, just because you don't like it or because it's bourgeois or like not to your taste or whatever. So Lenin has something going here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely worth noting that the historical situation of the Bolshevik Party is very different than like the United States in 2019.
Yeah,
100
totally.
years later, after the revolution, no doubt about that. But the advice is the same. Like, the idea of you think that you're just going to skip over all this stuff, then you're sorely mistaken, I think is a good way of putting it. I like too that it's classic Lenin. Like, I think there's a line, I want to say it's in State and Revolution, but it's somewhere in Lenin where he says something like, a communist should be basically mistaken for being an anarchist. But like, here's why the state's actually very important. Like, I like that moment in Lenin where he recognizes the principled opinion that you ought to have and the principled political stance and interpretation. But also, like you said, he has this pragmatic and practical side that's like, look, we all want to get there, but we have to recognize the real limitations and the real opportunities that we do have in the material conditions that we've got. Like, we don't get to choose them. They come to us, and you have to, play with the cards you've been dealt.
Okay. That's exactly right. So, Dean, if you like that, you're going to love this next quote from Lenin. Okay, cool. So this is from Lenin's Two Tactics of Social Democracy and Democratic Revolution. Lenin says this: Marxism teaches the proletarian not to keep aloof from the bourgeois revolution, not to be indifferent to it, not to allow the leadership of the revolution to be assumed by the bourgeoisie, but, on the contrary, to take a most energetic part in it, to fight most resolutely for consistent proletarian democracy, for carrying the revolution to its conclusion. We cannot jump out of the bourgeois democratic boundaries of in this case, the 1905 Russian Revolution, not the other one, the first one. But we can vastly extend these boundaries, and within these boundaries, we can and must fight for the interests of the proletariat, for its immediate needs, and for the conditions that will make it possible to prepare its forces for the future complete victory. So there you go. There is a way in which Marxism can just be like, well, none of this matters. Just wait for the revolution. Who cares about all this election stuff? It's like not important. It's distraction. And like, yeah, I mean, it is definitely a distraction, but also, it could be super important who's in charge. You never know, right? Case in point, Donald Trump is very bad. It's very bad that he's in charge, and it could be better if somebody else was. I mean, not perfect at all, but it could be better for sure. And it makes sense, right? If you're a communist and you care about the workers, and like that's like the kind of thing you're about, you want there to be a different society, like you should try to figure out any way you can to make things better for them. It's just the case that like if you can get you get more social democrats in office, right? That's a strategy. You get Medicare for all, you get all kinds of other things like more paid parental leave and like universal child care and these kinds of things, right? People will just start to figure out what they really like is socialism and not capitalism. And I think it makes some sense here. You need to expand the proletarian democracy where you can.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the thing that sticks out to me from, I think I maybe even mentioned this last week, I can't remember now, but the bit in Rosa Luxemburg about, hey, if there are workers' reforms that really make the life of working people better, then we should support them without any kind of hesitation. Just recognizing that we're trying to put those in a revolutionary horizon and not sort of stopping at the reform as though that's a victory. And not, one small step along a very long way. I think that is a good way. It at least helps me kind of frame these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, historically, communists have participated in elections around the world, but also in the U.S. and Canada, and they've even won some seats, real-life seats. Especially here in Canada, there's a really interesting electoral history, but also in the U.S. But obviously, it's a long way since that has happened. I don't even know when the last time there was a communist in a significant office seat would have been in either of those countries, but not in my living memory, that's for sure.
Yeah, totally.
So the question becomes, I guess, what are you supposed to do with all that faced with these electoral politics? Canada just had a big election. The U.S. is about to have one. And I think it helps to actually look at the Communist Party platforms in both of these countries just to see what they actually think about it. So I'll read the Canadian bit, or at least a bit from the platform. We could talk a bit about that, and then maybe I could say something about their participation in this previous election. Yeah. So the Canadian platform says this, which I think is really great. A democratic, anti-monopoly, anti-imperialist alliance will have as its objective the democratic restructuring of Canadian society so that the interests of the majority of Canadians come first and the stranglehold of finance capital on every aspect of life is broken. It will seek to advance the working people's interests through all available avenues of struggle based on massive and united extra-parliamentary action. The alliance will strive to score electoral advances and the winning of power by a people's government dedicated to carrying out sweeping measures to democratize society and transform economic relations in the interest of the working people and the Canadian people as a whole, the working class and Canadian people as a whole. Such a breakthrough will be difficult to accomplish given the sophisticated means at the disposal of the ruling class to manipulate public opinion, discourage political activism, and otherwise influence the outcome of bourgeois elections. The crucial task for the alliance will be to defend and expand democracy and to fight against corporate and governmental attacks on the electoral process. What I love about this paragraph is it's like all these things at once. It's like, on the one hand, you've got to get into the electoral stuff. It's a piece of the struggle. It's one available avenue of the struggle, and you should seek to, advance working people's interests through it. On the other hand, though, you've got to have some extra parliamentary action, and you also have to not be naive about the fact that at the end of the day, you're fighting an uphill and probably losing battle ultimately against the ruling class in that struggle. These kinds of principles were played out in the last Canadian election, where the party did run lots of candidates across the country in different strategic places. And it was really important because although, none of their party members got elected, elections are a time when people are out there talking about politics and they're ready to talk about it and they have opinions about it and the news is talking about it and communists want to be part of that conversation. And this is something that allows you to get inside people's apartment buildings and ask them to, put their signature on a piece of paper that says this person can run in the election, and you can hand them pamphlets that explain the program of the party. You can get candidates on a debate stage. For instance, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland in Canada, who has helped to organize the coup in Venezuela, for instance. The party ran a candidate against her named Drew Garvey, and it's great to see her have to deal with his criticisms in a public venue. Did it unseat her? No, obviously. Unfortunately, Drew Garvey is not in Parliament today, but it does actually raise questions for people that probably they wouldn't otherwise ever have thought about. And it's, again, just the nature of the cards we've been dealt, that you have to intervene in these kinds of situations as flawed and frustrating as they could be.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The communist parties in the United States are not all that far off. So, there's a lot of left groups in the United States, and we could probably go through a lot of them. They all work in electoral politics to different degrees, but we thought we'd just kind of stick with the classics, I suppose, for this one. So the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States of America, they have a kind of interesting approach to electoral politics. There's probably two things we could say about that, but I do want to quickly mention something about the Party for Socialism and Liberation, another Marxist-Leninist group that deals with electoralism a lot. In previous years, I don't know if it's happening this year, but they've run an actual candidate. Her name is Gloria La Riva, and she's been an interesting person. She runs kind of as an independent from the party, and obviously she doesn't win, but just the same, it's kind of an interesting thing that they do. It kind of brings attention to who they are and to, socialism and what's about. So, it's, I think it's sort of even just a matter of spectacle and outreach. It's definitely worth it, probably. So that's one thing, but the Communist Party has a little bit of a different approach, and it's more about coalition building and other things too. But I'll read you the bit from the Communist Party platform about electoral politics. The Communist Party, as part of the developing All People's Front to defeat the ultra-right, participates fully with the labor movement and its allies in building a strong people's electoral force. The Communist Party's approach to people's electoral politics is a basic aspect of our view that the current stage of struggle requires an all-people's front to defeat the ultra-right. This is an essential strategy to the historical period, not just a temporary shift in tactics. Ultra-right political dominance challenges the vast majority of people in this country, even including some sectors of monopoly capital, and very broadly, unity is both possible and necessary to bring about major political shift. Without the shift, the people's movements will be continually on the defensive. Without building this broad unity, the ultra-right will succeed in splitting their opposition, will continue to succeed in settling the priorities and agendas for the nation, and will risk ever greater military adventurism in pursuit of an illusory global dominance. Without first defeating the ultra-right section of monopoly, the working class and its allies cannot proceed to radically curb the power of monopolies as a whole. So there's two things we can say about the CPUSA and their approach to electoralism here. First, it's all about coalitions. That's their big thing. If there's like a labor candidate, if there's a union person running in a local election, CPUSA will show up for them and kind of like promote them on, the internet and elsewhere. A lot of people who are in CPUSA are like really kind of plugged into the labor movement. So a lot of like old school union people are a part of CPUSA. The other thing here that's really interesting to me is that like the whole point is that like the right is such a huge force in the United States that like if you ignored electoral politics, you would create such a worse situation for yourself. I mean, it's not entirely different than the CPC and their approach, but it's just like if you don't like electoralism, well then like fine, somebody else does, and it is the right. So, get involved in some way in coalition building and showing up for like unions and like union leaders, or, you're going to suffer the consequences, which is just another right-wing government. And I think that's a pretty fair approach, honestly. I don't know. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. I agree.
Yeah, and I mean, you get certain criticisms of this from the further left folks, where it's like, if people just elect Democrats or whatever, things aren't going to fundamentally change, which is true, obviously. I mean, that's accurate. It's if we had Hillary Clinton as the president, or I mean, heck, even Elizabeth Warren or others, or even Bernie Sanders, like we're not going to get a different response in terms of opinion about like the Maduro government in Venezuela, for instance. And that's a tragic and an unfortunate reality. But at the same time, like it would be frankly like stupid and willfully naive to suggest that like things wouldn't be different both at home and abroad in some pretty material and tangible ways if Donald Trump wasn't the president, for example, regardless of who else might have been in office. And it's like, yeah, it sucks. It's a huge bummer, but it is what it is. And I think there's something about like not getting lost in the electoral sort of scene and not thinking that is actually what politics is. Like, for sure, all those things are true. And even, communists and Leninists, that's kind of what people are always saying is like, don't get hung up on the spectacle of bourgeois elections. But nevertheless, like, you should see them as a vehicle, as an avenue of struggle that you are compelled to participate in a specific kind of way, not just as an observer or a pundit or whatever, but as somebody trying to really think about how to activate the contradictions that are present in those kinds of moments, and hopefully drive people toward a more, drive people to feel more welcome in a radical coalition that says no to all those things down the road.
Yeah, I think that's really important to say. I mean, if you don't like Hillary Clinton, then you're going to hate Donald Trump, right? Like, it is definitely a bummer, but you're right. It's an important thing. Okay, well, here's a dissenting opinion from someone who I respect. So how about this?
All right.
This is from an essay that was written in The Forge, which is like an online sort of like radical newspaper or whatever. It's called Against Electoralism, and it's by Alison Escalante, who you might recognize from the Red Menace podcast. She's very smart and knows a lot about Leninism and sort of Marxist philosophy, so that's why I'm listening to her in this case. Okay, so this is what she says. Okay. Getting a candidate elected takes resources. The New York chapter of the DSA mobilized members to register 20,000 new voters, rallied around traditional campaign promotion, and in the end, successfully propelled Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to a successful election win. That happened. That's how this whole thing is prefaced. And then in the sort of later in this essay, it turns and says this. Imagine if all those hours the DSA poured into electing Ocasio-Cortez were instead used to feed the people of New York, to provide them with medical care, to ensure their needs were met. Imagine the masses seeing socialism not as a pipe dream we might achieve through electing more imperialists, but as a concrete movement which is currently meeting their needs. The fact is, we are not nearly ready for revolution. Socialists in the United States have failed to meet the needs of the people, and as long as their only concrete interaction with the masses is handing them a voter registration form, they will continue to fail the people. Our task now is not to elect representatives to advocate for the people. It is much more gruelingly laborious than that. Our task is to serve the people. Our task is to build dual power. So that's like the Leninist thing at the end about dual power, which is another thing. We talked about that a lot with Drew Van Land 100 years ago. So go back and look for that one, I guess. But I appreciate this intervention because it does give a little bit, I don't know, of good criticism of that electoralism. That, like, just kind of like you said, Dean, like if you get too weighed down in it and think like that's what politics actually is, it could be very bad. On the other hand, I don't know. I don't think it's altogether bad that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected. I think that's probably, I mean, again, you know, she's not perfect, but a net win for the left, I would say. Better than a lot of other things that could have happened in that case. But I do get the sentiment, though, right? So, like, what if instead of worrying about electoralism, you poured all of your time and energy into actually, like, doing sort of, like, organizing work and meeting with people and feeding them? And I think that sounds pretty good, too. It's like a helpful intervention, but one that doesn't, I think, kind of take care of the base sort of need. But it's a good one to keep in mind just the same.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's also worth noting that, like, I get the point that's being made here, right? And I sometimes have my own frustrations with certain people I know in the DSA, not all. This is not a stand-in for the DSA as a whole, but certain people that I know who, you know, do think that basically politics is about spending all your time canvassing for somebody and making phone calls and stuff on behalf of a candidate. And that's true. Like, that is bad. You shouldn't think that. But at the same time, like, the DSA does do a lot of other stuff, like, you know, holding brake light clinics and organizing against ICE and really, like, putting their nose to the grindstone and serving the people. Like, the DSA does try to do these two things, sometimes in ways that are really good, sometimes in ways that you wish that they would just stop talking about, like, some weird local Democrat. But yeah, you know, it's a huge movement full of, like, lots of identity confusion. And I think it's important to sort of affirm, like, not only that, like, okay, it's true, the DSA probably spends a little too much time, I think, sometimes on electoral stuff when they could be doing some other things, but it's not like they're not doing those things either. And in that sense, it's like, you know, the left has to find a way of, like, I don't know, building these broad coalitions. Like, I think the Communist Party platforms are right. Like, you have to find a way to not reduce your politics to elections, but also not write them off. And so, yeah, I agree with you. This is a really helpful intervention. I guess I don't know why I feel the need to, like, stand up for the DSA, which I'm not even a member. I don't even live in that country. But yeah, I guess I've just seen so many people, like, really put their heart and time into serving the people in material ways through that organization. And I think that is actually something to kind of, like, keep building up and affirming.
Yeah, totally. I think that something that's kind of interesting in both of these takes, though, is that, like, the whole point of having a party is that you can create a culture and sort of, like, a structure where people who would be good politicians could come from.
Right.
Like, and I guess it's the bummer about not having a very strong left party in the United States or in North America. I mean, I'm not going to speak for the CPC because they're good, but I mean, like, in the United States, at least, right? There's, like, not one left party that could actually articulate sort of, like, something that could actually form people into, I don't know, the communists and socialists that the world needs at any given moment. And I guess that's kind of too bad, because, I mean, if you want to do electoralism, I mean, I don't know. The DSA is a good example, though, right? Like, if you wanna run for a local office or a national office or whatever, right? And you're in the DSA, you have to run as a Democrat. Like, even in the United States, a dude from St. Louis ran for a local office, and he's a CPUSA member, like a pretty high up guy, and he still had to run as a Democrat. And like, that's, I guess, fine, but it's just like without a strong sort of party infrastructure and a strong like culture of being a party, you can't really get beyond, I don't know, that. And that's just a bummer.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's the other piece of it too, is like just having a sobering look at what's really going on. And in that sense, I really sympathize too with what Allison says here about, we're not ready for revolution. It's not around the corner. And building that culture, as you put it, even in the party, but beyond it too, is probably one of the best things that you can do. That's what made like the Black Panther Party attractive to its own constituency. It's what made the Young Lords attractive to its constituency. It's what makes churches attractive to people, and it's also what makes churches sites of like revolutionary energy in places like Latin America. Is exactly that. These are the people you can count on to like help you get fed and give you medical care, and so those are the kinds of people too that you're gonna be willing to have like a conversation about politics with. And that's true in a way that like giving someone a voter registration card or like asking them to sign a piece of paper is not true.
Right. And if you're mad about the types of like left candidates you get, like most leftists in the United States are mad about, then like, I don't know, the only solution is to create a sort of party culture where you could create better ones, right? Like if you're mad about the options you have, it's because there's no space to sort of form these people and give them political education and whatever. Like, I don't know. You can be mad about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez all you want, but like we'd have better candidates if we had a party, if there was like a solid sort of infrastructure that can create these people and train them and like make them the people we need.
Yeah, and like parties are thankfully trying to do that kind of work. But there's a lot of challenges, a lot of problems to doing it.
It lacks a really unified sort of force, right? Like there's no the party. There's just a bunch of like very fragmented folks doing their best, but not together, which is a bummer.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I guess in the end, if you want people who are better than Pete Buttigieg, you got to have a vibrant communist and socialist party that is like strong enough to do it. There. That's I'm putting the big Christmas bow on it. Put it under the tree. Unwrap it next month.
That's good. Do not open till Christmas unless you wanna. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. We recently posted a boring debate coverage episode there, bonus coverage from when I was visiting Matt recently in Greenville. So you can listen to that. You can listen to all our hot electoral takes. There's a bunch of other stuff there too. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at the Magnificast. You can send us an email at themagnificast@gmail.com, and we'll see you next week. Oh wait, I forgot to say. Our music, as always, is by Amoria Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
Church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still